Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual program of the Commonwealth Club of California. I'm Cheryl Davis, the Executive Director of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission, and I am pleased to be your moderator for today's program. We appreciate your considering a donation to support the Commonwealth Club's work, and if you wish to do so, please click on the blue donate button at the top of the YouTube chat box or visit the club's website at commonwealthclub.org. We also want to remind you to submit questions via the chat room next to your screen, and I'll get to as many as possible later in the program. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Randall Kennedy, professor at Harvard Law School and author of the new book, Say It Loud. Professor Kennedy teaches courses on contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. He was born in Columbia, South Carolina, and attended Princeton University, Oxford University, and Yale Law School. He also served as the law clerk for Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. In his new book, Say It Loud, Professor Kennedy chronicles his reactions over the past quarter century to arguments, events, and people that have compelled him to put pen to paper. Three beliefs that are sometimes in tension with one another infuse his writing. First, Professor Kennedy observes that a massive amount of cruel racial injustice continues to beset the United States. He says this ugly reality has become alarmingly obvious with the ascendancy of Donald Trump and the various political, cultural, and social pathologies that Trump and many of his followers display and reinforce. Second, Professor Kennedy observes there is much about which to be inspired when surveying African-American journey from slavery to freedom to engagement in practically every aspect of life in the United States. Third, he says an openness to complexity, paradox, and irony should attend any serious investigation of human affairs. Today, we're going to have hopefully a compelling conversation with this acclaimed legal scholar and public intellectual about what the past 25 years tell us about the future of race relations in America. Welcome, Professor Randall Kennedy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I am really honored and grateful and humbled by the opportunity to have a conversation with you. I just going through the pages of the book has just been kind of thought-provoking and inspirational. And I think I'll start with kind of the most obvious questions just in terms of the title of the book, Say It Loud. Of course, immediately I see James Brown, moving around on the stage and see his heels up in the air and kind of backing up and doing, I guess, the first version of the moonwalk, some would say. Why that title, right? Why choose that, in this space of, anti-Blackness or pro-Black or Black Lives Matter in some ways, uh, uh, you know, uh, he was the first one to really say Black Lives Matter and to have people take some ownership of being Black and proud. And so why that title?
Well, it's a catchy title. You remember it, and I remember it too. And I remember it with tremendous fondness. And so I thought it'd be a nice, catchy title, and that's the main reason. It's also, I think, exemplary of a certain sort of double-sidedness that I wanted to show throughout the book. On the one hand, I remember with fondness James Brown's "Say It Loud, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm proud." I remember it. I remember dancing to it. It was great. Now, that's the positive side. The negative side is, why in 1968 did someone have to proclaim that? I mean, generally you don't go around proclaiming that you are proud of this or that. You're proud of it, and you're settled with it, and you just go on about your business. Why was this such a controversial? Why was this so, why was this so arresting? It was so arresting because, of course, behind the proclamation, "Say It Loud," was the reality that there were many African Americans in 1968 who did not view Blackness with pride. There were many just people. I mean, in the United States of America in general, Blackness was denigrated. It was derided, certainly among many white people, but among many Black people too. And so it was that double-sidedness that I wanted, and I talk about that in the essay, as you know. Yeah. But there's also a third thing. There's also a third thing, which is the question of, race pride. Should people be, quote, proud of their race? Now, it's one thing to be completely satisfied, completely happy, completely at ease with whatever racial category you're in. But should someone be prideful of it? And so, as you know from reading the book, that's a question that I investigate in a number of the essays, and I think we should be careful about pride.
Well, it's interesting because when you said double-sidedness and having looked through some of the essays and just thinking about even the area talking about the politics of respectability, right? And so when you talked about double-sidedness, I went back to these images of what was respectable and what was, and so I kind of went to, well, was this also a play on when you talk about double-sidedness? Was James Brown respectable, right? Like with the conch, or with with the relaxed hair and the language and the enunciation and the dress. And, I even think about when, as we were talking about this, I'm like thinking about even as folks look at the respect, the RESPECT with Aretha Franklin, and understanding how much she did for the movement, right? And that folks maybe didn't see it off top. And even in the same way that James Brown was really supporting the movement in a lot of ways, but you wouldn't have gotten that from his performance on stage where, you talk about your parents saying, don't act like a coon. But I would imagine that some of the older folks probably thought that that was coonery in some way. And
absolutely. Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. You mentioned my essay on the politics of respectability. I'd say of the essays in the book, that is the one that is probably the most criticized by my students. They really, many of my students really don't like my embrace of the politics of respectability. And you're right, one has to be, one has to be careful with everything. I mean, I embrace the politics of respectability. I think that one ought to be very careful about the way in which one, presents oneself to the public, especially if you're an activist, especially if you're part of a political campaign. You want to draw people to your side. Well, if you want to draw people to your side, don't needlessly alienate people. I think that's generally good. I think that makes sense. At the same time, just like you point out, there are a lot of people who go back to 1968, who didn't like James Brown, with the conch, with the clothes, just like there are people in the generation before who, didn't like jazz, didn't like soul music. And then to, bring it up, what about the people who didn't like rap, all rap, viewed rap as being completely, disreputable. So, I love jazz. I like a lot of rap. I certainly like a lot of soul music. I like Soul Brother #1. So one has to be careful about, all these things. And I guess one of the themes of the book is, well, let's be careful, let's think, and let's, by the way, also be willing to rethink, because, there's nothing wrong with changing your mind.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I really wrestled myself with, like, I could see myself as someone who grew up in the Bay Area, but was born in the South, right? And grew up
Where?
here, Texas, just outside of Dallas, little town, Denison, Texas, and Sherman County. And like the respectability politics was all like I laugh about my grandmother's sister who her boyfriend used to tease her because she would go to barbecues with white gloves on, and he was like, why are you wearing white gloves to a picnic barbecue? But that sense of like having come from a sharecropper father and a slave grandfather, like her idea of how she needed to show up was very real. And I think the other piece of this, there's a question around the impact of George Floyd's murder well over a year later. And one of the things that I was resonating with me as I was reading the essay around the narrative shift that you really talk about, or the counter narrative, and this idea of respectability politics, I thought about George Floyd or even Trayvon Martin, and how things changed in the sense that it wasn't, now we're going to protest and put on our white shirts and our jackets, but people wore hoodies. They actually took on what would have been a negative to do this counter narrative, right? And same thing, like it didn't matter what George Floyd's past was, or his history was, or what he was wearing at the time of his demise, right? And that in some ways, I'm like, how do you talk about this kind of shift that now we're not going like we're going to hit the streets and we're going to all be dressed in our Sunday best, but we're going to hit the street representing and dressed in the way of the folks who were afflicted, in terms of like the humanizing of folks. But how do we, there's a two-part for me with that. Like it's that kind of shift that we're seeing where, now we're not dressing up to protest, but we're actually representing the folks who have been impacted. And they don't have to be, as you talk about Rosa Parks, the perfect one for this place, right? They can be Claudette Colvin at this point in time. They don't have to be with the flawless background. But now we're a year past George Floyd and all of the social unrest that we saw last year. How do we make sure that we don't lose some of that movement, that really the organization of the 60s, right? Where they had the movement and they were like, okay, we're going to train, we're going to prep, and we're committed to doing this for the duration. So really this two-part, one is how we've had this shift of you don't have to be dressed up to protest, and that you don't have to be without sin to be recognized as violated. And how do we make sure those changes don't get lost, in the case of George Floyd?
Yeah. Well, on the first point, the question of how one presents oneself, it's so interesting. One of my great heroes, one of my favorite people of all time, is the great John Lewis. Now, John Lewis early in his career as a dissident, was part of the sit-in movement. He was a freedom rider. And he, along with all the other freedom riders, adopted a very conservative protocol in terms of dress and in terms of manners. James Farmer of the Congress of Racial Equality demanded that freedom riders dress in a certain way. And he told them why. He said, because you're likely to get arrested. And when you are arrested, when your picture goes in the newspapers, I want people to view you in a certain way, not just white people, but your relatives, your folks, Black people too. And it seemed to me that he was really on to something, James Farmer. It was a very smart thing to do. Now, later in his career, and John Lewis, by the way, abided by that. You see John Lewis when he was at Selma, when he's knocked over by the horses, and he's clubbed on the ground. One of the great moments in the history of the world, as far as I'm concerned, the stoic heroism he showed. Look at how he's dressed. He's coming from a church. He's coat and tie. Well, that part of that was political. He wanted to have it leave a certain impression. A few years goes by, 2 or 3 years later, you see John Lewis. How is he dressed? He's dressed in overalls. He's appealing to the sharecroppers. He's saying to them, listen, I'm not biggity. I don't think I'm any better than you. I'm with you. And I'm going to show that I'm with you. So again, I'm not saying that people have to, do, frankly, anything in particular. Circumstances change. I am saying, however, that I want you to be thoughtful about how you present yourself. So when I encounter activists who say, I don't care, I don't care what they think, well, my response to them is, well, you're just being stupid and irresponsible. Of course you should care. You should care how your neighbors think. You should care how your allies think. You should care how your followers think. And oh, by the way, you should care how your adversaries think too. On your second point about, how do we maintain momentum? It's a great question. I don't think that I have, I wish that I did have a fully worked out answer to it. I do not. I think it's a very difficult thing to the maintenance of momentum, the maintenance of morale. I think it's quite remarkable that the activists over the past few years, especially with respect to the whole question of police misconduct, police brutality, police racism, for several years now, those activists have continued to keep that issue in the air, continue to push that issue towards the center of political consciousness. I salute them for doing that. And how we do that, not altogether sure. I think people can do it. There's a huge country, people are differently placed. If you're a teacher, if you're a poet, if you're a filmmaker, if you're a politician, those are very different spheres. And I suppose, you try your best in all of them. But I'm not altogether sure how one does that. It's a great question. I hope people are working on it.
And do you think, or have you seen, this question from the chat, what changes in treatment of African Americans by the police? Do you think that there's been some change? I mean, I think we can see it on some, locally and nationally, but what's your take on that as you talk about race relations?
I'd say two things. Number one, we still have a scandalous condition. The scandalous condition is that these powerful agents of government that walk around with, weapons that can, kill you are regulated so loosely. I mean, I'm not disparaging the police. The police have a very difficult job to do. They have an essential job to do. I want the police, frankly, to be supported. I am a supporter of good policing. It's absolutely essential. But they should be regulated.
Mm-hmm.
The law shouldn't, we shouldn't, turn away from misconduct on the part of the police, as what happens so often. And so I think we're still in a scandalous situation. The law is failing us on that score. But has there been change because of the protests, because of the spotlight on the police? Yes. You name me. I mean, just in the last year, there have been more. I've read more articles about police prosecutions, investigations of the police, police bureaucrats being shown the door. I've seen more of that than I have ever seen, and I can't help but think that that is registering on the ground. Is that enough? No, it's not enough. We need to have, we need much more change, and we need to institute it. We need this change to be instituted in our bureaucracies. We need to have a situation in which police who are friendly to the citizenry, police who are courteous to the citizenry, police who show respect to the citizenry, those are the police that get promoted. Those are the police that have wonderful careers. We should shape things in such a way that we get the police that we want. Has that been done? No, I don't think that's been done yet. That's what we need to push toward. But has there been some change? Yeah, there's been some change.
It's interesting because you mentioned John Lewis, and I had the opportunity to host him a few times in San Francisco, and people would ask him, are things better, and what's, and with his trademark trench coat, and and he'd say, look, same thing you're saying, things are not where they need to be, but are they better than when he was walking and protesting and marching? Definitely, right? And so this idea of what you hit in the first essay there around, shall we overcome, right? This idea of optimism versus pessimism, and how we're moving through space, and keeping hope. I have, I think every page I've got like something where I just pulled out, because this idea of the ancestors in so many ways, holding on to hope, right? But the reality of resistance and the burden of resistance. And, Cornel West has a book, Prophetic Black Fire, where he talks about and really basically says, some folks don't live long enough for us to see their shift and their change and their mindset. And I feel like you really document in this, where somebody who starts out as optimistic, if they stay around long enough, they kind of flip. And that someone who starts out pessimistic, if they stay around long enough, they also flip. And this kind of juxtaposition of like living and fighting, and the burden that it takes on your mind and your soul. I mean, did you find that this kind of like sometimes people's their advocacy outlives their passion, or that their passion outlives their advocacy?
Sometimes that essay, there's a reason why that's the first essay in the book. That's the essay that in a way frames the book. In many ways, it's the essay with which I struggled the most. So this is an essay on optimism and pessimism in African-American thought. And I've been in the optimistic camp, but as you know from reading that essay, I have changed somewhat. One of the reasons why this essay means so much to me personally is because my father whom I revere, my father of blessed memory, Henry Kennedy, was a thoroughgoing pessimist. Thoroughgoing pessimist. My father's answer to the question, shall we overcome, was no. It doesn't mean that you don't struggle. It doesn't mean that you don't stand up for your, whatever rights you can get. But my father's view was that the United States of America was created for white people, and that's the way it was just simply going to be. Now, the pessimistic, and so he was part of the pessimistic tradition, and that in my household, I heard that. The pessimistic tradition is actually, it's a very interesting tradition, because on the one hand, in the pessimistic tradition, you have people like, well, my father, you have people like Derek Bell, who's a longtime colleague of mine. You have, Elijah Muhammad. In the pessimistic tradition, Black nationalists would certainly, many of them in any event, would certainly be believers that, the United States of America is, white man's country, and it's going to stay like that. Marcus Garvey. Along with those folks, however, you also have Thomas Jefferson. You also have Abraham Lincoln. You also have Alexis de Tocqueville. That's in the pessimistic tradition. In the optimistic tradition, in the 19th century, the great spokesperson would be Frederick Douglass. The great Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, even before the abolition of slavery, was asked whether he could see a day when white people and Black people would live together as equal neighbors in this country. This is before the abolition of slavery. And he said, yes, I can see that. In the 20th century, the great spokesperson for this view would be Martin Luther King Jr. Listen again to I Have a Dream. In the 21st century, the most consequential spokesperson for this point of view would be Barack Obama. Now, again, I still situate myself in the optimistic camp, but I have to tell you that in the last few years, I've been shaken. The last few years have filled me with trepidation. I thought we were further down the road to racial decency than we are. And, like I say, I'm still in the optimistic camp, but I'm there with a sense of unease.
Well, I mean, I as you're saying that, I just think even the most optimistic are still have that tinge of pessimism, right? Like I think about in King's book, a collection of sermons, Strength to Love, he basically tells people to confront their shattered dreams, right? Like he understands that there's going to be disappointment, that we're going to have these frustrating moments, and that in essence and in earnest, we're going to continue to come up against this wall. And one of my favorite poems is one by Maya Angelou, and Life Doesn't Frighten Me at All. And she has a line that says, don't show me frogs and snakes and listen for my screams. If I'm afraid at all, it's only in my dreams. So this idea of hoping is the thing that brings fear and terror more than the fear and terror of just living and breathing. So I think that as I was reading through this, that's the one thing that I did leave with. And I left with this idea that, as our, much in the same way as the Negro National Anthem, right? Like that talks about, coming through all these treacherous things and all of this stuff, we're still rising and hoping. And even Maya Angelou is saying, you may trod me in the very dust, but still like dust I rise, right? Like, so she's saying it's all going to be bad. It's all going to be bad, but somehow we keep believing and hoping.
Well, I mean, James Weldon Johnson, love James Weldon Johnson. And of course, Lift Every Voice and Sing is a great articulation of the optimistic tradition. It's also one of the great, patriotic songs in the canon. and those two things often overlap, the patriotic tradition, the optimistic tradition. Again, Martin Luther King, remember, I've glimpsed the promised land.
Yeah.
I mean, remember, he said that hours before he's killed. And when you see it, you have the premonition, you sense that this is a man who maybe, feels that the end is near, but he was optimistic. I've glimpsed the promised land. Question, how confident now? Yeah. And further, what is the promised land? So, one of the last essays in my book talks about competing visions of the promised land. The great Martin Luther King Jr. told us that he had glimpsed it. He didn't tell us a whole lot, however, what it looked like. What was its topography? Where were its boundaries? What was the smell? What was the look? How did people act in the racial promised land? And, that's for us.
Yeah.
I think that actually we need to think about that a lot more, actually. What if we had the power, what would the racial promised land look like? How would we act in the sort of society that we actually want to create?
Well, it's interesting because one of the questions, talking about the promised land and what we're hoping for, in San Francisco, we have a reparations advisory committee, which my office is overseeing. And one of the questions is, how do you view the reparations movement? Is that part of the promised land? Is that, paying for the harm that's been done? And what are your thoughts on the reparations movement?
I'm gonna tell you, generally speaking, I am, very sympathetic towards the reparations movement, have written in favor of it. One of the reasons, probably frankly, the main reason is, there are a lot of people who are in need. And, if the reparations idea will funnel services, funds, opportunity to people in need, fine, because I want those things to be funneled to people in need. Here's where something that hangs me up, though. Imagine, should we be so concerned with why people are in need? So there are people who are in need, and one of the reasons why they are in need is because they are the victims of a long train of, catastrophes, a long train of atrocities, racial atrocities, slavery, segregation, for Native Americans, the taking of their land, the destruction of their polities. I mean, we could go on and on. That's how some people end up in need. On the other hand, what about a person who's just come to the United States, They are in need because of terrible things that have happened other places. What do I say to them? Is their need less than somebody else's need because of the circumstances that made them needy? I don't, so for me, I want to focus more on need. However, whatever the history of that need is secondary in my mind to the fact these are needy people. We have a country, we're fortunate enough to have a country that has resources that can, if we want, we can shift resources to people in need. That's what I want, regardless of why.
So a couple of things. One is connected to the focus on need, which is a question from the chat about what role should government play in helping those who are, as they put in the chat, disenfranchised. But I would say, to your point, what's the role of the government to help those in need? You know, should it be a larger or smaller role than private groups? But I think my question, even before that, just still connected to the reparations piece. Yes, what should the government be doing to help those in need? But is there a debt owed to the descendants of slavery, right? Is there something beyond giving to just folks in need? Is there, for folks who made money off of plantations and folks who made money off of Black folks and have now become, created this legacy or organizations or businesses, do they owe something to those descendants? I guess that's my question, just with regards to reparations. Beyond meeting a need, is there a debt owed?
I want to flash a big yellow light of caution on that. I'm from Columbia, South Carolina. I suspect that my descendants, that my forebears were, probably enslaved. Just suppose we learn that my forebears were part of the small sliver of free Black people. Just suppose I learned that my forebears were part of the even smaller, but still in existence, they still existed. What if I learned that my forebears were Black slave owning people? Well, so if I learn that my great grandfather was a slave owning Black, what? So, and somebody says we have evidence of this. It's true. I don't contest it's true. Then the person says, and for that reason, I want you to do such and such and such and such. To me, I'm willing to do a whole lot. That particular set of reasons, however, doesn't, frankly, doesn't move me. Yeah. And I think we need to be history is a scramble. My sense of this is that the atrocities are so great, they're so deep, they are so horrible that there is a good impulse in us to want to do something about the horrible past. It's like this evil was out there and we can't bear to allow sort of the evil to get away. So we want to catch the evil, we want to domesticate it in some way. And my sense is that reparations is our way for trying to, sort of get solace, sort of reach a settlement. But I'm going to say, but here I'm going to say that the terrible fact is, as far as I'm concerned, I'm calling it a fact. Maybe it's not a fact, but I'll call it a fact for now. Evil was done. We are not going to catch it. It's, it may very well be that my great grandmother, or, we don't have to go back that far. That's exaggerated. I knew my grandmother. My grandmother knew her parents who had been in slavery for a while. So we don't have to go all that far back.
Yeah.
But so let's just say that, one of my relatives was sold from their family. Auction block. I can't catch that.
Right.
Irretrievable, irredeemable. Right. And so for me, I want, what can we do to create as much social decency as we possibly can now? And as to the question about government, yes, we need the government. What do you mean? The government is all around us. And by the way, everybody's using the government. I mean, when somebody says, well, do you want poor people to use the government? The rich people use the government. I mean, the airlines use the government. Amazon uses the government. Lots of people are using the government. Why do we all of a sudden, when it's poor people, should they use it? Yes, we need to use the government. The government is, we need to use the collective strength of our society to create a decent society for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And as you're saying that, I'm having I'm seeing or I'm picturing the essay that talks about the Women's Convention of the National Baptist Convention and how those women were like coalescing and coming together, and and then another line that you had that talked about basically fighting racism isn't just in this theoretical, but it's also about, it's one with, the spades and the rakes and the like getting in there and getting dirty and turning over the soil. And so I wonder in that context, how are we doing, or should we be doing more to also stand up those cultural and those community groups that come with a level of pride and relationship that can engage? Can we replicate some of what I feel like in some ways was lost in terms of our communities and our infrastructure?
One of the things I try to show in this set of essays is that over the course of American history, people of all complexions, all races, have done remarkable things in the effort to extend racial justice. People have used what was at hand. So you take a person, take Emmett Till's mother. Here's this, totally modest woman, doesn't have much. Mm-hmm. She has a son who has just been sent back to her in a coffin. What does she do? What does this poor, modest woman in bereavement do? She takes the corpse of her son and uses it in the struggle for racial justice. I mean, greatness. And there are other people throughout American history who have taken what was at hand. And I think that there are people in our country today who are doing this. I don't think it's the case that, once there were great people and now not. No, I think that there are people all across the United States who are doing things that that are deserving of tremendous praise. Yeah. Again, let's think about, last year and the hundreds of thousands of people that in the middle of a pandemic, raised their voices. Or another thing, in the middle of a pandemic, think about a year ago, the future of the United States was on the line with the elections. And there were people in the middle of a pandemic. I think of people, for instance, in Wisconsin, in one of the primaries. It was a very important election, local election, very important. In the middle of the pandemic, there were people who stood in line for hours, putting at risk their health because they felt it was so important to vote the right way. I thought of the people in Georgia. My word, the people in Georgia stood in bad weather for hours, regular folk, You're not going to read about, there's not going to be any front page, magazine article about these people. These were people, just regular folk, stood in line, disciplined, did what they could. That spirit is still abroad. We need to enlarge that spirit. We need to applaud that spirit. We need to encourage that spirit in our young people.
Agreed. And connected to some of what you talked about, there's a question about, can you comment on voter suppression in America and where our electoral system is headed? And you talked about, just the passion and the commitment, I think, of those states where folks, it got a little bit harder to vote, and yet they stood for hours to do it.
We are in a bad situation. I mean, think of it. It's obvious. You don't have to be a rocket scientist. It's obvious what's going on with respect to voting. There is obviously a concerted effort across the country to suppress voting, in a supposed democracy. It's an outrage. And the excuses that are voiced, the talk about voter fraud. What are you talking about? Infinitesimal, totally marginal. It's made, virtually made up. Sometimes it is made. It's ridiculous, but it's got a lot of power behind it. And there are agencies, obviously, there has been, and I think that unfortunately there will continue to be sufficient political power mobilized to prevent reforms that would diminish this voter suppression. And then you have the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court of the United States a few years ago eviscerated the leading leading Civil Rights Act of the Second Reconstruction, namely the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Our Supreme Court, I'm not talking about some Supreme Court in, the 1890s. I'm talking about our Supreme Court.
Right.
Eviscerated unjustifiably the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We are in a perilous situation, and people need to organize and be on their P's and Q's and do everything possible to turn things around, because in all too many respects, not all, but in all too many areas with respect to all too many issues, we are going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, and listening to you makes me think about in your essay around Derek Bell and me, right? You do that conversation and you say he was really critical of your not doing advocacy, or his perception that you didn't do advocacy. And can you say more in terms of like that advocacy that he was referring to? Because was it about within the institution or globally? What really is that?
The essay to which you refer is the second essay in the book. I think it's the longest essay in the book. It's called Derek Bell and Me. And I spent a lot of time on that essay. It means a lot to me. I mean, I was a colleague of Derek Bell's. I was a friend of Derek Bell's. But we had a very complicated relationship. I said I was a friend. I think that's true. But we had a tempestuous relationship. We were adversaries sometimes. And we, why? Well, partly generational. He was my senior. I think he had experiences that prompted him to take a different view, a different look. Our work was extremely important to both of us, and we had very different experiences. For instance, at Harvard Law School, Derek Bell was the first Black tenured professor at Harvard Law School. but he always felt like he was an outsider there. And he was all, and he felt like he was an outsider there in part because he never got his props there. And one of the reasons why I wrote this essay is because, yes, I'm critical of him. There's still certain things, you've read the essay, I remain very critical of certain things. But I think as a thinker, as a scholar, as a writer, he deserved more than he received in terms of the attention and of colleagues. And one of the reasons why I wanted to write this is because I wanted to take seriously his work, praise what I thought was praiseworthy, criticize what I thought ought to be criticized. But we had a very complicated relationship. There's certain features of his work that I've criticized in the past, and you know from reading the essay, I take back my criticism and I say I was wrong. And I make certain apologies in this essay. And, you know, Derek Bell's been in the news lately. And I think that people are revisiting his work, and that's good. Again, I'm critical of certain things, very critical. But he was a person, he was a serious person. He was a hardworking intellectual, and he's a person deserving of respect. And I certainly hope that I conveyed my respect for him in that essay.
No, definitely. It prompted so many thoughts. And one of the questions that came up is around half of Americans, largely Trump supporters, don't seem to acknowledge actual facts. How can we change that? And it just really, for me, this idea of where you call him the godfather, really, of critical race theory, or acknowledge that he's been considered that. And this whole kind of conversation around critical race theory and what we talk about in schools and what's real, and you know, this the retelling of history just made me really think about the voice and the work and that push, you know, the foundation that you share around Derek Bell just really intrigued me. I'm going to be spending some of my reading moments trying to go back over and find what you point out in this space. But this idea of how do we get folks to acknowledge the facts, and critical race theory, I think, is an example of the challenges we're facing.
Listen, you know, this critical race theory controversy, there are organizations that invite me to be part of discussions about critical race theory, because I've been I've been very critical. And I think sometimes when I get invitations to these things, they invite me because, you know, I'm a person sort of on the left, and they figure, you know, oh goody, we're going to get somebody sort of on the left to, you know, attack critical race theory. So let me just say a couple things. First of all, I think that the effort to banish critical race theory is a very dangerous effort. And frankly, whatever you think about critical race theory, you should shun the effort to banish it. This is a terrible encroachment on freedom of thought, freedom of learning. It's a terrible threat to our schools at every level. And so I just want to put that out there. Second of all, you know, people have made a boogeyman of critical race theory. And again, there's certain features of it that, you know, that I reject. And, you know, we can talk about that if you'd like. But I would like to say that the central aspects of critical race theory, as far as I'm concerned, the central themes are perfectly sensible. One theme of critical race theory, probably the most central, is racism has been absolutely foundational in American political culture. It is, you know, pervasive. It has been deep. It has been influential. Well, frankly, you know, what? Is that wrong? That's true. Secondly, the second big theme of critical race theory is that the reforms instituted by the Second Reconstruction, anti-discrimination law, is not enough. I mean, that was a big point. They said, listen, great Civil Rights Act of 1960, Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, Open Housing Act of 1968, Brown versus Board of Education, Loving versus Virginia. Great, 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 great. But at the end of the day, on the ground, the situation is that racial minorities remain marginalized, remain stigmatized, remain subordinated. It was not enough. So we've got to do more. We need new initiatives, more aggressive initiatives. Again, I say, listen, okay. It seems to me, frankly, a lot of that makes sense. And so, no, I do not want to be associated in any way with the attack on critical race theory that we've seen. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't criticize certain aspects of critical race theory. One thing I criticize, for instance, some people who identify themselves with critical race theory have, in my view, been all too, have been insufficiently attentive to the claims of freedom of expression. So there are some people with critical race theory who say, no big deal in banishing, in suppressing, in censoring, racist expression. Well, no, I'm not going to be. No, I'm critical of that position, and I think what's going on now partly shows why I'm critical of that position. Donald Trump says that critical race theory is itself racist. The people who are trying to banish critical race theory are saying we're trying to banish a racist belief. Well, that shows why one needs to back up off of the banishing of, the attempts to banish ideas. That can work a lot of different ways. You can be the target of that. So, hey, let's be careful. I stick to ACLU type, National Coalition Against Censorship type ideas. One of the things I think has been great about, frankly, American democracy, there are certain things which are really quite good about the American political culture. One of those is a very, very vigorous, embrace and support of freedom of expression. And that it seems to me needs to be, we need to redouble our efforts and expand freedom of expression as opposed to, drawing down our efforts. So in that way, I'm critical of some of the people with critical race theory. But again, people ought to understand not everybody who calls themselves a critical race theorist believe the same thing. There's
Right.
probably some critical race theory people who would say, with respect to that, they're on my side. So we need to, again, folks need to read. Don't just take, some, one sentence from some, from a new, one paragraph or one sentence or one 10-second clip from somebody who characterizes critical race theory. Take the time to actually read what people have to say.
Yeah. I mean, the question too then is beyond even critical race theory, but some of these like revisionist, right? Like to rename slavery, to say that it's not slavery, right? Like, how do we get folks to acknowledge the facts, this idea that, slavery happened? Like, people may not want to talk about it, but do we erase it from the history books? And this is why I also wrestle with, the idea of statues and monuments, because, and I know you have ideas and thoughts on that as well. Like, it's not taking those statues and monuments away does not erase what happened during that time. And so are we missing an opportunity to learn, to talk, and to look at history? And so these ideas of facts,
We need to be very careful again, I applaud the people who, in an effort to advance, anti-racism, have demanded that we pay attention to, the monuments and other memorials around us. I'm great. I'm all for that. We should know what's around us. We should know about the people who are called heroes, even if they did, atrocious things. We should know that. But we need to be careful about our tactics. We need to be careful about our aims. So let me tell a little story about where I am at Harvard Law School. The symbol for Harvard Law School used to be an insignia that was taken from the family insignia of a family that donated. Actually, its donation was central to the founding of Harvard Law School, the royal family. And students learned about this a couple of years ago and said, let's get rid of this insignia. I mean, this is horrible. These people were slave traders. And the law school, by the way, did get rid of this insignia. Okay. There was a committee to discuss this and try to figure out what should we do. The chair of the committee, maybe she wasn't the chair, but she was on the committee. One of my colleagues, Annette Gordon-Reed, wrote a dissent. The majority opinion was, let's get rid of the insignia in honor, let's get rid of the insignia to repudiate, that slave holding and slave trading, and to honor the people who were so terribly victimized. My colleague, Annette Gordon-Reed, wrote a dissent and said, you know what? I want to maintain the insignia to honor the enslaved. Because what she was afraid of was, okay, we get rid of the insignia and, in a few years, people will have forgotten about the enslaved. I think that she is on to something there. I think, we need to be very careful about erasing so much that, in 30 years, you'll have people who will think that there was, well, gosh, was there a Confederacy? Yeah, there was a Confederacy not so long ago. And by the way, even after the Confederacy was defeated, I'm going to tell you something else. There were a lot of people who considered Robert E. Lee to be a great hero, even though he took up arms against the United States of America. Don't forget that.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate that. And I think those are the hard conversations. And I know that people get caught up in the debate about, it's some of what you hit on. And I really appreciated it in, I can't remember which of the essays, but this idea of going along to get along in some way, right? That, I think it was the Princeton, the essay about the ultimatum of Princeton, and that, folks sign on to things that they may or may not agree with in the name of, not looking like they're not supportive. So I think that that's the thing that we wrestle with so much, right? Like, how do we speak our truth without being called a racist or having the dissenting opinions? And so I guess my final question would really be, in this sense, like, how do you hope people will use this book? Because I do think, I actually was looking at some of the essays this morning and I was like, oh, I need to be able to use these for some of our workshops and engagements with folks to really use it as a tool. But how do you hope or envision that the book can be used? Because I think it opens it up to both sides really of the conversation.
I hope that people will buy it and read it and discuss it. And, I hope it will be informative. I hope it will be provocative. Those are my hopes for this book, along with, all my other books. I don't expect everybody to agree with all of it. I have friends whom I like and deeply respect who disagree and disagree strongly with various aspects of it. And, that's fine. I mean, and, as is clear from the book, I disagree with myself from time to time. It's not like I stay put. There are a number of places in this book where I say, 10 years ago I said this, but upon rethinking, I think that I've changed my mind for these reasons. I want people to grab the book and take it seriously.
Right. Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity to speak with you, and have already started to quote many pieces from the book. I appreciate the language, the candor, and the honesty, and encourage folks to get a copy, to read it, and enjoy it, and be motivated to do a little bit more. So our thanks to Randall Kennedy, professor at Harvard Law School and author of the new book, Say It Loud. We want to remind everyone that Professor Kennedy's book is available online and at your local bookstore. We also want to thank all of our viewers. I'm Cheryl Davis, and now this virtual program of the Commonwealth Club of California is adjourned.
Thank you.